German naval officer vanished in 1941. 84 years later, his coastal bunker was discovered. September 14, 2024, the Jutland coast, northern Denmark. The storm had been building for 3 days. When it finally broke across the Jutland Peninsula in the pre-dawn darkness of September 14, 2024, it did what storms on this coast have done for centuries. It took something away, and it gave something back. The North Sea, gray and indifferent, stripped nearly 4 meters of compacted sand from a coastal embankment near the village of Thyboron, a small fishing settlement where the Limfjord meets the open sea. Local residents had grown accustomed to coastal erosion along this stretch of the Danish shoreline. They had seen it before. A few meters of dune face would collapse, reveal a layer of dark, compressed sediment, and then the tide would reclaim it all within a week. But what the storm of September 14th revealed was not sediment. By 7 a.m., a retired schoolteacher named Morten Agard had already walked his border collie along the embankment path, as he did every morning regardless of weather. He would later tell Danish investigators that he nearly missed it entirely. The exposed face of the dune was dark with moisture, and the object blending into the saturated earth was the same approximate color as the surrounding clay. But something about the geometry stopped him. A straight line in a world of curves, a right angle where nature produces none. What Morten Agard had found was the reinforced concrete corner of a structure approximately 8 meters wide, buried under nearly 3.5 meters of accumulated dune material. The outer surface bore the characteristic ribbed texture of military-grade Tobruk concrete, a distinctive construction method used exclusively by German engineers during the Atlantic Wall fortification program between 1942 and 1944. The structure had been sealed. Not collapsed, not destroyed by post-war demolition as the surrounding fortifications had been. Deliberately, methodically sealed. Danish Coastal Heritage Authority Kystdirektoratet was notified by 9:30 a.m. A team from the National Museum of Denmark's Military Archaeology Division arrived at the site by the afternoon of September 15th. By the following morning, preliminary ground-penetrating radar scans had confirmed what the exposed concrete suggested. Beneath the dune lay a structure of unusual complexity. Not a standard Tobruk pit or observation post, but a multi-chambered installation roughly 22 meters in total length, running perpendicular to the coastline and descending at a slight gradient toward what the scans suggested was a sealed rear chamber. Excavation began on September 19th under the direction of Dr. Sophie Lindqvist Holm, a military archaeologist specializing in Atlantic Wall structures. Her team worked carefully. The outer chambers yielded the expected detritus of wartime occupation, corroded ammunition casings, fragments of field equipment, collapsed wooden furniture, and the remnants of a communications installation whose cables had long since oxidized beyond identification. Then, on the morning of October 3rd, the excavation team broke through a secondary internal wall of brick and mortar, a post-construction addition, clearly added after the original building was complete. Behind that wall was a space the investigators would later designate Chamber 7. Inside Chamber 7, the air quality instruments registered an unusual preservation environment. The sealed chamber had maintained a relatively stable humidity and temperature for decades, protected from the coastal environment by the outer structure and the wall of brick. On a wooden shelf reinforced with iron brackets, investigators found a waterproof steel box of German military manufacture, model designation Feldstahlkasten M35, a standard-issue document container used by Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine officers throughout the war. Inside the box were the following items, catalogued by Dr. Lindqvist Holm's team on October 3rd and October 4th, 2024. A Kriegsmarine officer's identification booklet, a soldbuch bearing the name Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Albrecht Mau, serial number KM447132, assigned to the 3rd U-boat Flotilla, Kiel, dated 1939. A set of personal photographs, including one showing a uniformed naval officer standing beside a submarine conning tower, annotated on the reverse in German handwriting. La Rochelle, May 1941. A folded nautical chart of the Jutland coastline with hand-annotated markings in 2 colors of ink. A personal journal, its leather cover darkened but its pages largely intact. And at the bottom of the box, tucked inside an oilskin envelope, a second identification document. A Danish civilian passport in the name of Heinrich Andreas Mahler, issued in Copenhagen, dated November 1941. The official German naval record had declared Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Albrecht Mau killed in action on October 28, 1941, when U-boat U-571 was reported lost with all hands in the North Atlantic. The passport in the box was dated 3 weeks after his death. The journal in the box contained 214 handwritten pages. And the final entry, written in a careful, controlled hand, was dated March 3, 1962. Heinrich Mau had not died in October 1941. He had vanished, and for 21 years after the war's end, he had kept writing. If you want to see what investigators found inside that journal, what it revealed about one man's extraordinary escape and the network that made it possible, hit the like button and subscribe. Because what comes next will fundamentally change what you think you know about who survived the Second World War and how. Heinrich Albrecht Mau was born on February 7, 1907, in the coastal city of Kiel, Germany, a city whose identity was inseparable from the sea and from the naval power that the German Empire had built there. His father, Gerhard Mau, was a senior maritime engineer at the Germaniowerft shipyard, one of the primary construction facilities for the Imperial German Navy. His mother, Elissa née Brandhorst, came from a family of Lutheran pastors in Schleswig-Holstein. It was, in every measurable way, exactly the kind of background that produced German naval officers. From his earliest years, Mau demonstrated an aptitude that set him apart from his peers. His school records from the Kieler Gelliatenschule, the prestigious classical secondary school in Kiel, show consistently exceptional marks in mathematics, technical drawing, and what his teachers described in a 1924 assessment as an unusual capacity for spatial reasoning and problem-solving under pressure. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him in his youth, a particularly political young man. He was disciplined, technically gifted, quiet in company, and intensely focused when presented with an engineering or navigational problem. He entered the Marineschule-Murwick, the German Naval Academy at Flensburg-Murwick, in the autumn of 1925, at the age of 18. The academy, situated on the western shore of the Flensburg Fjord, trained him in the full curriculum of naval seamanship, navigation, ballistics, torpedo mechanics, submarine warfare theory, hydrographic surveying, and the operational doctrines that the Reichsmarine was quietly developing in contravention of the Versailles Treaty's limitations on submarine forces. He graduated in 1929, ranked 4th in his class of 31 cadets, and received his commission as Lieutenant zur See Ensign in the surface fleet. Between 1929 and 1935, Mau served aboard the cruiser Emden and later the destroyer Z4 Richard Bateson, accumulating sea experience and developing a reputation among his superiors as an officer of exceptional composure and technical precision. His efficiency reports from this period, declassified from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg in 2019, contain a recurring phrase. Mau demonstrates a capacity for independent decision-making under adverse conditions that is rare in officers of his grade. He was, in the language of naval personnel assessment, a natural problem solver, someone who did not freeze when circumstances departed from the expected. In 1936, following the formal re-establishment of the German submarine arm under Reichsmarine reorganization into the Kriegsmarine, Mauer applied for transfer to the U-boat service. He was accepted immediately. His technical background made him a natural candidate for submarine command. U-boat operations required precisely the combination of mathematical precision, spatial reasoning, and independent judgment that his record demonstrated. He completed the compressed U-boat training program at Neustadt in Holstein and received his first command, the coastal submarine U-11, in 1937. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, Mauer held the rank of Oberleutnant zur See and was attached to the first U-boat flotilla operating from Kiel. He was promoted to Kapitänleutnant in January 1940, and by the spring of that year had completed 2 operational patrols in the North Sea with noted success. Records indicate that his boat, by then U-39B in the flotilla's training rotation, performed 3 confirmed simulated attack runs against British convoy traffic during exercises that would later inform actual operational doctrine. His real combat service began in earnest in the summer of 1940. Following the fall of France in June and the establishment of German naval bases on the Atlantic coast, Mauer received command of U-571, a Type VIIC submarine, the workhorse of the German U-boat fleet, and was assigned to the 3rd U-boat flotilla based at La Rochelle. The Type VIIC was a vessel of considerable capability, 220 feet in length, capable of sustained submerged speeds of 7 knots, armed with 14 torpedoes and an 88mm deck gun. It was the submarine that fought the Battle of the Atlantic. From July 1940 through the summer of 1941, Mauer conducted 5 operational patrols in the Atlantic. His record was distinguished. Over those patrols, U-571 was credited with the confirmed sinking of 4 Allied merchant vessels totaling approximately 22,000 tons of shipping, and the probable damage of a 5th. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class after his 2nd patrol, and the Iron Cross First Class following his 4th. In the brutal arithmetic of the U-boat war, he was considered a successful commander. But the record also shows something the official commendations do not capture. By the autumn of 1941, the nature of the Battle of the Atlantic was changing rapidly. Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities were improving with disturbing speed. The introduction of improved ASDIC sonar, the deployment of long-range maritime patrol aircraft, and the expansion of convoy escort forces had transformed the tactical environment from the happy time of 1940, when U-boats had operated with relative impunity, into something far more dangerous. Losses in the U-boat arm were rising. Among Mauer's own cohort of La Rochelle-based commanders, 3 had already been lost with their boats by September 1941. And Heinrich Mau, the precise engineer, the problem solver, the man whose efficiency reports praised his independent judgment under adverse conditions, was paying close attention to the mathematics of his own survival. His personal situation added another dimension. On the night of July 24, 1941, British Royal Air Force bombers struck the city of Hamburg in what would be one of the early large-scale RAF raids on German urban centers. Among the casualties was the apartment building at Harvestehuter Weg 14, where Mauer's wife, Clara Mauer née Schreiber, had been living with their 2 children, 6-year-old Georg and 4-year-old Ng. The building received a direct hit. Clara Mauer died in the rubble. The children survived and were evacuated to Clara's parents in Lübeck. The notification reached Mauer in La Rochelle on July 29, 1941. He received a 4-day compassionate leave and returned to Germany to attend the funeral. He was back at La Rochelle by August 5th. He said nothing to his fellow officers beyond what was required. He filed the necessary paperwork. He resumed his duties. But something had changed. Those who knew him in that final period, and several surviving accounts exist, including those collected by the German U-boot archive at Cuxhaven, noted a new quality in Mauer's demeanor. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more calculated, a man taking stock. What investigators would eventually understand was that Heinrich Mau had, in the weeks between returning from his wife's funeral and departing on his final patrol, already begun to plan. The weeks preceding the departure of U-571 on its sixth operational patrol can be reconstructed with unusual precision, because Mauer himself documented them in the journal recovered from Chamber 7 of the Thiboron bunker. The journal, authenticated by handwriting analysis conducted by the Bundeskriminalamt's Forensic Document Division in November 2024, covers the period from August 12 through October 27, 1941, the day before the date officially recorded as his death. August 12, 1941, Mauer returns from compassionate leave. The first journal entry is spare, almost clinical. Hamburg, buried Clara. The children are with her parents. The mathematics of this situation require re-examination. The word he uses, Neuberechnung, is not a word of grief. It is an engineer's word, recalculation. Between August 12th and September 3rd, U-571 underwent routine maintenance and refit at the 3rd Flotilla's facilities in La Rochelle Harbor. The journal entries during this period record two things. First, Mauer's careful study of the casualty statistics accumulating in the U-boat arm during this phase of the war. He had access to flotilla operational reports and was calculating what investigators now understand was a survival probability analysis. Second, and more striking, a series of entries describing conversations with a man referred to in the journal only as Der Den, the Dane. The identity of the Dane was one of the first major questions the 2024 investigation sought to answer. Based on evidence assembled by Dr. Lindqvist Holm's team and corroborated by records from the Danish National Archives, investigators believe the Dane was most likely a man named Niels Thorvald Kierkegaard, a Danish maritime broker who had operated legally in occupied France as a licensed trader since the summer of 1940. Maintaining business relationships with German naval supply authorities, while simultaneously running a quiet network of informal assistance for individuals seeking to exit the occupied zone through Scandinavian channels. The journal records 3 meetings between Mauer and Kierkegaard, the last on the evening of September 18, 1941. The entry from that night reads, "The terms are agreed, the route is confirmed, the box will be prepared. If the patrol returns, the matter is deferred. If the patrol does not return as commanded, the alternative proceeds." This cryptic entry would take investigators weeks to decipher fully. What Mauer was describing, they eventually concluded, was a contingency plan, one that could be activated either upon his return from the upcoming patrol or in the event that the patrol encountered circumstances that made the plan's execution feasible. On October 2, 1941, U-571 departed La Rochelle on its 6th patrol. The official records show it heading into the North Atlantic shipping lanes, operating in the area south of Iceland near the convoy routes designated HX and SC. The flotilla's operational log records routine radio contact with the boat on October 8th, October 14th, and October 19th. The October 19th transmission reported the sighting of a convoy. There was no further contact. On October 28, 1941, 3rd U-Boat Flotilla Headquarters received a report, the precise origin of which has never been fully established, indicating that U-571 had been sunk by a British destroyer escort operating with convoy HX-156. The report cited an oil slick and debris observed by the escort vessel HMS Vannock at a position approximately 600 miles west-southwest of Ireland. No bodies were recovered. No survivors were found. The 44 officers and crew of U-571 were declared lost with all hands. The official death record for Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Albrecht Mauer was filed on November 4, 1941. His rank and decorations were recorded. His pension entitlement was forwarded to his surviving children's guardian. His service file was closed. But the journal in Chamber 7 tells a different story. Mauer's own account, written in retrospect, from a position of safety, but with the precision of a man who had kept meticulous mental notes, describes what actually occurred during those final days of October 1941, with a specificity that investigators found simultaneously extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The critical moment began not on October 28th, but 4 days earlier, on the evening of October 24th. At approximately 9 p.m., at a position several hundred miles east of where the official report would later place the sinking, U-571 encountered a British corvette operating independently. The engagement that followed lasted approximately 40 minutes. U-571 was depth-charged, and the boat sustained significant damage to its forward torpedo tubes and one of its diesel engines. No crew were killed, but the boat was, in Mauer's own assessment, no longer capable of continuing the patrol to conclusion. What happened next is where history and the official record diverge irrevocably. Rather than transmitting his situation to La Rochelle and requesting instructions, the standard procedure for a damaged boat, Mauer ordered radio silence. He ordered the boat to proceed east, not toward France, but toward the coast of Norway. And on the night of October 26th, at approximately 11 p.m., he implemented what the journal describes as the transfer protocol. A small inflatable dinghy was prepared. A watertight package of documents and valuables, Mauer refers to it as the preparation, was loaded onto it. Mauer transferred command of U-571 verbally to his first watch officer, Oberleutnant Zur C. Kurt Dieterich Engel, with a written order that Engel was to proceed to the rendezvous point he designated, then to report a sinking at the false coordinates and await further instructions. The journal does not record Engel's reaction, but the fact of the subsequent false report suggests Engel complied. Whether from loyalty, fear, coercion, or calculation, the first watch officer did what his commander asked. Mauer, alone in the dinghy in the darkness of the North Sea on the night of October 26th, began paddling toward the coast of occupied Denmark. The crossing took slightly over 16 hours. He made landfall near the town of Hanstholm on the northern Jutland coast in the early afternoon of October 27, 1941, the day before the official date of his death. He was dressed in civilian clothing that had been concealed aboard the boat since departure. His naval identification had been removed from his person and placed in the watertight steel box, the same Feldstahlkasten M35 that would sit in Chamber 7 for 83 years. At Hanstholm, Mauer was met by a contact whose name in the journal appears as F. The identity of F remains partially unresolved, though investigators believe this person was likely a local fisherman or harbor worker connected to Kierkegaard's network. F provided transportation, almost certainly a fishing vehicle, south along the coast to Thyborøn, where the bunker now lay buried. But in October 1941, the structure was not buried. It was under construction. The 2024 investigation, established through a combination of German military construction records and Danish wartime administrative documents, that the installation at Thyborøn was a secondary communications, relay and observer post associated with the Atlantic Wall fortification of the Jutland coast, begun in late September 1941 and completed in the spring of 1942. Mauer, with his position in the flotilla and his access to construction planning documents, had known about this installation months in advance. The journal confirms this. "I chose this site because I knew it. The outer work is not yet complete. No garrison is assigned until January. In the interval, it is mine." He sealed his documents in the steel box, concealed it within a gap in the incomplete internal structure, and departed the site before dawn on October 28th, the same date the German Navy declared him dead. He had spent less than 6 hours at the location, that would keep his secret for 8 decades. When Dr. Sophie Lindqvist-Holm first opened the journal in the preservation environment established by her team in a controlled laboratory at the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, she described the experience in a subsequent interview with the Danish newspaper Politiken as the most disorienting moment of my professional life. She had excavated dozens of Atlantic Wall installations. She had found personal effects, letters, fragments of lives interrupted by war. She had never found a first-person account of its own concealment. The investigation that followed the discovery was one of the most complex multinational forensic historical inquiries undertaken in Northern Europe in recent memory. By November 2024, it had expanded to include the National Museum of Denmark, the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, the German U-Boot-Archive at Cuxhaven, the Danish National Archives in Copenhagen, the Norwegian National Archives in Oslo, the Public Record Office section of the National Archives in Kew, England, and a forensic consultancy based in Hamburg specializing in Second World War document authentication. The first and most fundamental question facing investigators was one of basic verification. Was the journal authentic? Was the Soulbutch genuine? Was the evidence in Chamber 7 what it appeared to be, or was this an elaborate wartime deception, possibly a staged disappearance created by German naval intelligence for purposes unrelated to personal escape? Forensic analysis began on October 7, 2024, and continued through January 2025. The Soulbutch was examined first. German military identification books of this period are among the most thoroughly documented forgery targets of the Second World War, meaning that authenticators have extensive comparative material. The Hamburg forensic team, led by document specialist Dr. Renate Kowalski, examined the booklet under multispectral imaging, ultraviolet fluorescence, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, and high-resolution optical microscopy. The paper stock was confirmed as German military specification from the 1930-919 for one production period. The ink composition matched period-correct formulations. The stamps and seals bore the correct mechanical characteristics of Kriegsmarine administrative offices at Kiel and La Rochelle. The entry handwriting was subjected to comparison analysis against 3 verified samples of Mauer's handwriting drawn from his personnel file in the Bundesarchiv, a letter of application for U-boat transfer dated 1936, a patrol report filed with the 3rd Flotilla in September 1941, and a personal letter to his children's guardian in Lübeck, dated August 1941. All 3 comparison samples confirmed a consistent hand. The Soulbutch was genuine. The journal underwent parallel examination. At 214 pages of approximately 300 words each, the complete text represented roughly 64,000 words of handwritten German, an extraordinary document by any measure. The paper analysis confirmed period-correct materials for the 1941 entries, but with a critical finding that the investigation team had both anticipated and dreaded. The paper stock for entries made after approximately entry 120, covering the period from roughly 1944 onward, changed in composition, suggesting the journal had been continued in a different physical environment using locally sourced materials. This was entirely consistent with Mauer's situation after leaving Denmark. The ink composition across the full document showed multiple formulations corresponding to different writing instruments used at different periods, all consistent with long-term maintenance of a personal diary across multiple decades. The handwriting comparison across all 214 pages, conducted by 3 independent forensic examiners, produced a finding of high consistency, all confirmed as the work of the same individual, with normal variation attributable to aging and physical condition over the approximately 21 years the journal spanned. Then there was the DNA analysis. This was the element that, when its results were announced in January 2025, transformed the investigation from a compelling historical mystery into a matter of confirmed historical fact. In the Thyboron Bunker's Chamber 7, Dr. Lindqvist Holmes' excavation team had found, in addition to the steel box, two other items of significance: a folded woolen naval tunic, partially preserved by the sealed environment, bearing the rank insignia of a Kriegsmarine Kapitänleutnant and the ribbon bars of the Iron Cross First and Second Class, and a leather wallet containing, among other personal papers, a fragment of what appeared to be a lock of hair, wrapped in a small paper envelope on which was written in German, Jorg und in G. 1939. The hair samples were extracted and subjected to genetic analysis at the University of Copenhagen's Department of Forensic Genetics. Investigators simultaneously undertook the painstaking task of locating living biological descendants of the Mauer family. Heinrich Mauer's daughter Inge had married a man named Bernhard Hofstedt in 1960 and had two daughters before her death in 1998. One of those daughters, Dr. Martina Hofstedt-Kraus, a retired physician living in Hamburg, was located through genealogical research conducted in November 2024 and agreed to provide a DNA reference sample. The comparison, conducted in December 2024, produced a result consistent with a grandparent-grandchild biological relationship. The hair in the envelope preserved in Chamber 7 matched the genetic profile of Dr. Hofstedt-Kraus's maternal lineage. The hair had belonged to the children of Heinrich Albrecht Mauer. Their father had carried it across the North Sea in an inflatable dinghy. He had sealed it inside a bunker, and he had left it there, perhaps as a gesture of memorial, a farewell that was not meant to be found. Dr. Hofstedt-Kraus, when informed of this finding, gave a single statement to the investigation team and declined further comment. The statement, as recorded in the investigation documentation, read, "My mother never spoke of her father. She said he died in the war like so many others. She believed that. I believe she needed to believe that. I don't know what I feel about what you found. I think I need time." The investigation also moved in other directions simultaneously. The nautical chart recovered from the steel box, examined by specialists from the Danish Maritime Museum in Kronborg, showed hand-annotated markings in two ink colors that investigators interpreted as a route map. The first color, a blue-gray ink consistent with the period-correct formulation found throughout the journal, traced a coastal path south from Thyboron, along the Jutland west coast, and ending at a point near the town of Esbjerg. The second color, a darker, brownish ink that spectral analysis dated to a later period, estimated late 1941 or early 1942, extended the route from Esbjerg across the annotated position of the Danish-German border and into Schleswig-Holstein, with a terminal marking near the town of Husum on the German North Sea coast. What the chart appeared to show was not the route Mauer had taken into Denmark. It showed the route he had subsequently taken out. The investigation now shifted from archaeology to archival detective work. What had happened between Mauer's arrival at Thyboron in October 1941 and his departure from Denmark, through Esbjerg and into Germany, in a period the chart suggested was late 1941 or early 1942, and how had he done so as a dead man? The Danish civilian passport in the name of Henrik Andreas Mahler, whose examination by the Danish Police Forensic Services had confirmed it as a genuine document issued by the Copenhagen Civil Registry Office, provided the key. The passport was dated November 4, 1941. That was the same date the German naval record officially closed Mauer's service file. Someone had obtained a genuine Danish civilian passport for a man who needed to not exist. That required access to the Danish Civil Registry. It required money. It required connections inside the administrative apparatus of the German occupation itself. And it pointed directly toward the network that had made Mauer's escape possible. a network far larger and more sophisticated than a single retired naval officer acting alone. The investigation was about to get considerably more complex. Heinrich Mauer's escape from the German Navy in October 1940 was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a planned operation, carefully prepared over a period of at least 2 months, executed with engineering precision, and supported by an organizational infrastructure that the 2024-2025 investigation gradually revealed to be both more extensive and more disturbing than anyone had initially anticipated. The network through which Mauer moved, the organization that provided forged documents, safe passage, and ultimately a new identity, was one of several operating in occupied Northern Europe during the war years that served a dual, sometimes morally contradictory purpose. On one end of its client spectrum, it helped persecuted people escape German authority, Jewish families, resistance members, Allied airmen shot down over occupied territory. On the other end, as the war turned against Germany from 1943 onward, it increasingly served as a conduit for those fleeing German authority in the opposite direction. Officers, officials, and administrators who could see which way events were trending and were making arrangements for their own futures. The network's principal documented figure, confirmed through a combination of the Thyboran Journal, Danish police wartime intelligence records, and files declassified from the Danish State Archives in 2016, was Niels Thorvald Kierkegaard, the maritime broker who appears in Mauer's journal as the Dane. Kierkegaard was born in Esbjerg in 1904. He had operated a legitimate maritime brokerage business from La Rochelle since 1939, initially working through the German Occupation Administration's licensing system for approved Danish traders in occupied France. His legitimate business provided cover for a second, informal operation that Danish wartime intelligence had been aware of since approximately 1941, but had never moved against, partly because the network was useful to Danish resistance operations, and partly because its activities were difficult to prosecute without compromising Danish informants inside the German administration. In November 2024, investigators from Dr. Lindqvist Holm's team and representatives from the Danish National Archives made a critical discovery in the archive's collection of wartime administrative records. Among the files of the Copenhagen Civil Registry for the period October-November 1940, one was a registration record for a Danish citizen named Henrik Andreas Mahler, purportedly born in Odense in 1907, who had applied for and received a civilian travel passport on November 4, 1941. The supporting documentation included, as was then required, a birth certificate, a residence registration certificate, and a character reference. All 3 documents were forgeries. The birth certificate was a skilled imitation of Odense civil registry format. The residence registration was created using a stamp stolen from a Copenhagen district administrative office during a burglary recorded in the police files for October 28, 1941. The character reference bore the signature of a Danish Lutheran pastor in Copenhagen, a real person who, when interviewed by Danish police in 1948 in connection with an unrelated matter, stated that his signature had been used without his knowledge on documents he had never seen. The man who had arranged all of this was, the evidence indicates, Kierkegaard, operating through connections inside the Copenhagen civil administration that he had cultivated through business relationships with German occupation officials who were themselves, in some cases, receiving payments for their cooperation. What the network provided was essentially a complete identity replacement service. For a fee which in Mauer's case, the journal indicates, was paid in the form of 60 gold marks removed from U-571's emergency reserve fund before his departure, a fund that technically belonged to the German Navy and which Mauer had simply taken, plus a diamond ring that had belonged to his wife. The network would produce documentation sufficient to establish a new civil identity in the Danish or Swedish system. This identity could then be used to obtain legitimate employment, housing, and, critically, passage across borders that the German occupation administration monitored for military deserters. From Thyborøn, the reconstructed escape route moved south along the Jutland west coast over a period of approximately 10 days in late October and early November 1941. The journal records two intermediate stopping points. The first, described as a farm south of Lemvig with a gray barn and 3 horses, was almost certainly in the coastal agricultural area between Thyborøn and the town of Struer, a location that investigators, based on wartime agricultural registry records, were able to tentatively identify as a farm registered to a family named Vestergaard in Hvidbjerg parish. The second stopping point was Esbjerg itself. Specifically, the journal references the warehouse district near the South Harbor, the building with the painted anchor on the door, a location that may correspond to a warehouse property recorded in the Esbjerg Harbor Authority's wartime records as leased to a maritime storage company with connections to Kierkegaard's brokerage. From Esbjerg, the route then turned unexpected. Rather than continuing into Sweden, the standard escape direction for Allied evaders and persecuted civilians during the occupation, Mauer's route, as reconstructed from the chart and the journal's subsequent entries, moved back into Germany. This initially puzzled investigators. Why would a German naval officer escaping German military authority move toward Germany rather than away from it? The answer the journal provides is simultaneously logical and disturbing. Mauer was not trying to reach Allied territory. He was not seeking to end the war or to surrender. He was trying to achieve something far more pragmatic, to become invisible within the population of wartime Germany itself, as a civilian with documentation solid enough to withstand routine scrutiny, in a period when the disruption of population movement caused by bombing, evacuation, and labor mobilization was already beginning to generate conditions of documentary chaos that an intelligent man could exploit. He crossed back into German Schleswig-Holstein in mid-November 1941, traveling under the Mahler passport. The journal records this crossing with laconic brevity, passed the border at the crossing near Aventoft without difficulty. The young guard did not look carefully at the photograph. No one looks carefully at a Danish civilian in a fishing coat. From Husum, Mauer made his way inland. The journal's subsequent entries, now entering the phase written on the later period paper stock, trace a life of deliberate, careful invisibility. He settled initially in the city of Hamburg itself, having calculated that a large, heavily bombed urban center was the safest place to disappear. A city whose records were disrupted, whose population was in constant motion, and where no one asked questions of a quiet Danish civilian carpenter who paid his rent on time and kept to himself. The network through which Mauer had escaped served, the investigation confirmed, approximately 40 to 60 individuals over the course of the war. The majority were relatively ordinary cases: resistance couriers, Jewish families, escaped prisoners of war. But the investigation's archival work also identified, among the Kierkegaard network's probable clients, several names of considerably greater historical significance, including at least 2 SS officers from a logistics command based in Copenhagen who disappeared from their posts in the closing months of the war and whose post-war fates remain unresolved, and 1 Gestapo administrator from the Aarhus district, who appeared in post-war refugee records in Argentina under a name that forensic comparison of signature samples suggests was an alias. For most of the individuals who used the network, it had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had made them disappear. The journal recovered from Chamber 7 covers the period from August 1941 through March 1962. Over those 21 years, It records the second life of Heinrich Albrecht Mauer, a life conducted under the name Heinrich Andreas Mahler, and later under a further identity that the journal references but never names directly. From Hamburg, where he lived from approximately November 1941 through the summer of 1943, Mauer worked as a laborer and later as a technical draftsman for a civilian engineering firm that had contracts with the city's Reconstruction Administration. The journal entries from this period have a quality that forensic psychologist Dr. Eva Bernhardt, who provided expert analysis to the 2024 investigation, described as managed dissociation. He writes about his work, his lodgings, the progress of the war as he understood it from newspapers and radio. He writes almost nothing about emotion. There are no expressions of guilt about the men he left behind on U-571 or the families of the 43 crew members whose fate his decision had affected. There is one entry from December 25, 1941 that reads simply, "Christmas. I think of Georg and NG in Lübeck. I cannot contact them. This is the price I calculated." In the summer of 1943, following the RAF's devastating bombing campaign against Hamburg, the firestorm raids of July that killed over 37,000 people, Mauer left the city. The journal records his departure not with expressions of horror at the destruction, but with the familiar tone of recalculation. Hamburg is no longer suitable. The documentation systems are being reestablished. There will be checks. He moved west into the Netherlands, traveling as a Danish civilian worker, a category that moved with relative freedom under the German Occupation Labor Administration, and settled in the town of Groningen by September 1943. In Groningen, he obtained work in a shipping company, where his maritime knowledge, carefully presented as the background of a Danish coastal trade worker rather than a naval officer, made him valuable. He lived quietly in a rented room on the Herenstraat. He learned Dutch. He acquired a third identity layer, a Netherlands residence registration card in the name of H.A. Mahler Jensen, which the investigation confirmed through Groningen Municipal Archive records in January 2025, was a genuine Dutch administrative document issued in April 1944. After the liberation of the Netherlands in May 1945, Mauer remained in Groningen for approximately 2 more years. The transition from occupied to liberated territory presented its own risks. Allied forces were actively processing the civilian population, screening for former German military personnel. But Mauer's Danish identity held. His German accent, he notes in one journal entry, was a problem he managed by claiming a German mother, a common enough background among Danish-German border region families that it attracted no special scrutiny. He left Groningen in the summer of 1947 and traveled to Spain. The route through France is sketched only partially in the journal. He describes traveling through Belgium and France as a seasonal agricultural worker, staying at a Catholic mission in Lyon for 3 weeks in August 1947, and crossing into Spain through the Pyrenees near the town of Hendaye in early September. Spain, under Franco's regime, was by the late 1940s becoming a known terminus for various categories of post-war European refugee, and its attitude toward documentation was characteristically flexible. The final third of the journal, the entries from Spain, beginning in late 1947 and running through the final entry dated March 3, 1962, records a life settling into something approaching normalcy. Mauer worked in Barcelona and later in the coastal town of Sitges, where his maritime background found natural application in the local fishing and coastal transport industry. He acquired yet another layer of documentation, a Spanish residency permit, which investigators located in a copy in the Barcelona Provincial Archive, dated 1951, in the name of Enrique Andrés Müller, a Danish-born maritime consultant. The entries from this final period contain, for the first time, something approaching emotional reflection. In 1954, Mauer writes, I have heard through channels I will not record here that NG has married. I am glad. I am a dead man who is glad his daughter is living. There is no other sentence that contains my situation. In 1958, an entry reads, I have considered writing to Jorg. I have been considering it for 17 years. I conclude each time that the letter I would write would harm him more than it would comfort me. A dead father is something a man can carry. A living coward might be too heavy. The final entry on March 3, 1962 is brief. My heart troubles me. I am 65. I have arranged what can be arranged. The box near the northern water holds what I was. Whatever I become next, I leave it there. After March 3, 1962, the journal ends. Heinrich Albrecht Mauer, or Enrique Andres Müller, disappears from the documentary record. Investigators searching Spanish vital records found a death registration in Sitges dated April 17, 1962, for one Enrique Andres Müller, listed as a resident maritime consultant of Danish birth, aged 55, a decade younger than his true age, who had died of cardiac failure. He was buried in the Sitges Municipal Cemetery in a plot registered under that name. No family members were listed. No next of kin was notified. The man who had calculated the price of invisibility paid it one final time. Whether anyone in Sitges ever suspected that the quiet man who knew the sea was something other than what his papers said, that remains, like so much of this story, unanswered. The discovery at Thyboron in September 2024 and the investigation it generated have forced a reckoning that extends beyond the biography of one German naval officer. The case of Heinrich Albrecht Mauer asks questions that historians, legal scholars, and the descendants of wartime victims have debated for 8 decades, and which the evidence from Chamber 7 makes newly and uncomfortably concrete. The first question is the most uncomfortable. Was Heinrich Mauer a war criminal? The evidence does not support that classification in any formal legal sense. His combat record as a U-boat commander involved the confirmed sinking of 4 Allied merchant vessels. Those ships carried cargo and sailors. The sinkings resulted in deaths, but under the laws of naval warfare as they existed in 1940 and 1941, and as they were uniformly practiced by all belligerent navies in the Battle of the Atlantic, attacking enemy merchant shipping was a lawful act of war. There is no evidence in Mauer's journal, his personnel file, or any of the documentation recovered from the bunker that he committed atrocities against survivors, conducted unlawful attacks on neutral shipping, or participated in war crimes beyond the already terrible arithmetic of submarine warfare. He was, in the most uncomfortable sense, an ordinary participant in an ordinary role in an industrial war. He sank ships. Ships sank him too, or tried to. But the question of his moral accountability does not begin and end with his combat record. The decision he made on the night of October 26, 1941, the decision to leave his boat, to leave 43 men under the command of a junior officer with a fraudulent cover story, to use stolen naval funds to purchase his own disappearance, carries its own weight. Kurt Dieterich Engel, his first watch officer, was lost with U-571 sometime after the false report was filed. The precise date and location of U-571's actual sinking remain unknown, but the boat and its remaining crew went down without their commander, covering a lie that served only his survival. No memorial lists their names in connection with the truth of what happened. No investigation has ever sought until now to identify the actual mechanism of their loss. For the families of those 43 men, the official narrative that they died together in action in the service of their country was at least a coherent story. Whether the truth, if it were ever fully established, would be better for them is a question that defies simple answer. There is also the matter of the network itself. The investigation's finding that Kierkegaard's operation had facilitated the post-war escape of at least some individuals with genuine war crimes on their record places Mauer's use of that same network in an uncomfortable light. He was not himself a war criminal using escape infrastructure to avoid prosecution. But the same infrastructure, the same routes, the same bribed officials and forged documents served others who were. His gold marks and Clara's diamond ring, the price he paid, went into the same operational fund that may have helped men far worse than him disappear. This is the moral topology of the Mauer case. It is not a story of a monster. It is not the story of a hero. It is the story of a technically brilliant, emotionally detached man who calculated with engineering precision that his own survival was worth more than loyalty, more than law, more than the welfare of the men in his care. He was neither uniquely evil nor uniquely brave. He was precisely as human as that assessment implies, with all the terrible ordinariness it suggests. The victims in this story are not only the sailors on Allied ships. They are also the 43 men on U-571 who were given no choice, who died, whenever and wherever they died, under a commander's lie. They are the children in Lubeck who grew up believing their father died at sea, who carried that grief as orphans carry all their griefs, quietly and without resolution. Dr. Bernhardt, in her psychological analysis submitted to the investigation in February 2025, noted that Mauer's journal contains not a single direct expression of guilt over these specific harms. The men left behind, the children left to believe in a lie. She characterized this not as psychopathology, but as something she called the practiced anesthesia of the survivor, the cognitive mechanism through which people who have committed acts they cannot undo learn to live alongside those acts by refusing to examine them directly. He lived for 21 years after the war. He wrote 214 pages. He said a great deal and he said almost nothing. The site at Thiboron, spring 2025. On May 12, 2025, 7 months and 28 days after Morten Agard's border collie stopped beside a right angle in the sand, the Danish Ministry of Cultural Affairs officially designated the Thiboron bunker complex as a protected archaeological and historical site. The excavation, now complete, has been partially backfilled for preservation, with a single chamber, not Chamber 7, which remains sealed for archival purposes, but the outer communication room, left open to the elements and accessible to visitors via a boarding platform pathway. A small interpretive panel at the entrance to the site, installed by the National Museum of Denmark, describes the structure's history in 3 languages: Danish, German, and English. It includes the basic outline of what the investigation revealed. It names Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Albrecht Mauer. It does not pass judgment. It presents what was found, and it asks visitors to consider what they think. Dr. Lindqvist Holm, speaking at the designation ceremony, made an observation that has since been widely quoted. We excavate these sites looking for evidence of the past. What we found here was evidence of a man. And the difference between those two things, between a historical record and a human decision, is exactly what makes archaeology sometimes feel like it is reaching through time to tap you on the shoulder. The steel box, the Feldstålkassen M35, is now held in the National Museum of Denmark's collections, accession number OA20241843. The journal has been fully transcribed and digitized. The Solbutch is in archival preservation. The hair samples from the envelope marked Jorg Unden G, 1939, remain at the University of Copenhagen's Forensic Genetics Department, with Dr. Martina Hofstedt Krause's reference DNA on file. There is no grave for Heinrich Albrecht Mauer in Denmark. The grave in Sitges, Spain, bears a different name over a man who spent 20 years erasing the one he was given. Somewhere beneath the clay and sand of the Jutland coast, in a structure built by an occupying power to defend the Atlantic Wall, a man sealed the evidence of his own existence and walked away into the fog of a wartime night. He was 34 years old. He had 2 children he would never see again. He had calculated that the mathematics of his survival required their father to cease to exist, and he had found the sum acceptable. Was he brave? In a technical sense, perhaps. What he did on that dinghy in the October North Sea required physical courage, regardless of the moral weight attached to why he was in the dinghy at all. Was he intelligent? Undeniably. The plan he executed, the network he used, the identities he maintained across multiple countries and multiple decades, these required exceptional discipline and intellect. Was he good? That is the question the bunker cannot answer. That is the question the journal leaves open on purpose. History keeps many kinds of secrets. Some of them are kept in archives that have simply never been fully examined, documents waiting in folders, patient in the way that paper is patient, which is to say absolutely. Some secrets are kept in the memories of people who made a calculation once about what was worth saying and what was worth carrying in silence to the end. Some are kept in the earth itself, in the sand and clay of a coastal dune that received a steel box one dark October night and held it without complaint for 83 years, through decades of storms, through the reconstruction of the countries involved, through the lifetimes of the children whose hair was kept inside. The North Sea coast does not moralize. It receives what is given to it and it returns what it chooses on its own schedule when the conditions are right. The storm of September 14, 2024 chose, after 8 decades of patience, to give something back. What it returned was not simply a box of documents. It was a question, asked in the handwriting of a man who sealed it there and never expected an answer, about what we owe the truth when the truth is inconvenient, about what we owe the living when the dead have already decided their own accounting. Heinrich Mau wrote his last journal entry on March 3, 1962, and chose silence. The Dune spoke on September 14, 2024, and chose otherwise. Somewhere in the archives of countries that have not yet been asked the right questions, in the foundations of buildings that have not yet been disturbed by a season's unusual storm, in the sealed chambers of structures that a retreating sea or an eroding hillside has not yet reached, other boxes are waiting. The earth keeps its secrets carefully, but it does not keep them forever. And sometimes, 83 years later, a dog stops at a right angle in the sand, and everything that was meant to stay hidden comes quietly, irrevocably into the light.